We're here because of a river, and not just any river. She spans a continent, and with her tributaries forms one of the great river basins of the world. New Orleans was founded where it is because of that great river, and in time she became a magnet, attracting to her commerce and people, trade, industry, for working and for living. Around the Queen City of the Mississippi grew other smaller communities, each with its own unique blend of people, each with its own reason for being, each with its own history. In time, the legislature would call her Jefferson Parish, but she would always think of herself as the Free State of Jefferson, a community as storied, as lively, and as interesting as her more famous sister, New Orleans. A community is not formed by political considerations, not by lines drawn on a map. It is rather the mixing and mingling of people that in time produces a community, the daily living together that changes a place into a home. Welcome to Jefferson Genesis, the story of our community. Chris Luckbaum and Emma Pearson have made a study of the history of Kenner. We met them at the Kenner Museum on 3rd Street to talk about their favorite subject. Emma, I know you've done a lot of research on this, and I did not know until, I guess, fairly recently, when the city of Kenner started becoming proud and reviving its history, that at one time the area was known as Camp Brûlé. Where does it come from?
It's a French term, and exactly why it was called Can Brûlé can't really be documented, but the sources to which one goes to research this are the sources of the early explorers, the journals kept by the very early French explorers. I think it was first mentioned by Pennico, who was a fascinating man of his time. He was a ship's carpenter, and he was with the expedition of d'Iberville in 1688 to 1689. He was a rarity because he was a very well-educated carpenter, and he wrote Monsieur d'Arteguet and de Bienville came there together along with Monsieur de Saint-Denis, and went back up the Mississippi River as high as Can Brûlé. So that was the first mention of Can Brûlé in 1708. Why they called it burnt canes, we're not really sure.
That's the translation, Can Brûlé, burnt canes.
Right, but we know that the name remained under the French colonial times and Spanish domination. The Spanish name for it was Caños Torquemados, which is what, please excuse my Spanish, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but the term remained there. And again, when under American rule, the term remained Can Brûlé until the census of 1820, at which time the inhabitants' names were substituted, as was the custom in the American census. We suspect that the early French explorers, as they came down the river, named the early place names descriptively. For instance,
Baton Rouge, Big Stick, Red Stick.
Yes, Horn Island, because one of the members of the party lost his powder horn there. Cat Island, the Rigolets, the Little Rivers. And so I suspect that when they came upriver and saw this burnt place, in contrast with the lush vegetation of the surrounding area, that they decided to name it Can Brûlé. And it remained as an early historical place name here.
Most of the early French exploration, was done by traveling the river as the most convenient route.
It's interesting to note the contrast between the French explorers. The French explorers and the English colonization patterns. The French Louisiana was part of the huge French crescent that extended from Canada all the way into the French West Indies, and Louisiana was sort of the center of that. the French kept their trading posts together with voyageurs who came by water and coureurs de bois who ran the woods, literally wood runners, and they hunted and trapped. The mercantile philosophy, the mercantilism was the philosophy of the time in terms of economic terms. The idea being colonies existed for the wealth of the mother country. I think that this was the...
There were less colonizers than they were exploiters of a resource.
Yes, that's what they did. Whereas, as opposed to the English who built roads and brought people to settle and remain. So the French colonies had a very different history. We developed concessions which were granted to people who were close to the king. Now, we're talking about a time in French history prior to the French Revolution, the late 18th century. So we're talking about a time in history in which democracy is relatively unknown. The concessions were given to people who were close to the king, the court, and two of them, established at Caen Brûlé, belonged to Monsieur d'Artagnan, who later, this family was known very well as popularized by Alexandre Dumas.
That D'Artagnan has his roots here in Canada.
Right. Well, he owned property here. I'm not sure
if
he ever came here, but he had a concession and he had workers there. And Père Chauvois, who was a Jesuit who was sent here to explore the conditions of the king's colony, visited here.
Now, the one thing the French did besides exploit was they really used the missionaries to spread the religion and civilization through
that. Yes, they did. The religion was a very important part of the French colonization effort, and many of the early people who came were associated with the French Catholicism.
Chauvois has a description, I think it's in Kenner, of seeing a huge cross with the Indians singing hymns.
Right, it was a cypress cross, and it was at this concession of Monsieur d'Artagnan. Père Chauvois was a Jesuit, and as I said, he was inspecting the colonies under the aegis of the king, so he received royal treatment, and everyone was wanting to stay in his good graces. So he gave a day-by-day account of where he spent the day and the afternoon, and he came down upriver from New Orleans, and he visited the Dubray concessions and talked about them. And when he arrived at Caen Brûlé at the concession of Monsieur d'Artagnan, there were the concessionaires who had arrived on ships from France were celebrating Vespers around the Cypress Cross, and he mentions this in his memoirs, and I think the date on that is something like January the 4th, 1723. So we know that Catholicism existed in Caen Brûlé in a very practical way at that time. You can see at the foot of Williams Boulevard today in Rivertown the reconstruction of this Cypress Cross, which commemorates this event, historic event.
Tell me something. How does it happen that the museum is located at 1922 3rd Street? What happened to 1st and 2nd Street?
Well, Front Street, 1st Street, and 2nd Street has been eaten up by the Mississippi River. We happened to be in one of the curves of the river that had been eating away, gnawing at the city of Kenner for many, many years. I wouldn't hesitate to say that I believe that's one of the most treacherous sections of the Mississippi River from its mouth to Baton Rouge, without a doubt.
Right here in this bend where Kenner is located?
Yes. I'm intensely interested in the Mississippi River. I grew up on the Mississippi River. Presently, I am a member of the Board of Commissioners of the East Jefferson Levee District. I was appointed by Governor Edwards, I believe, in 1979 or 80, and I was reappointed by Governor Treen, and then I was reappointed by Governor Edwards. and I'm concerned about what goes on the Mississippi River.
Well, I think...
And primarily because the Mississippi River has eaten up, as I told you, Front Street, First Street, Second Street, and the museum is facing Third Street. And there is only, in front of the museum, perhaps 150, 175 feet of land from Jefferson Highway or Third Street to the toe of the levee on the land side. Now, the river's been matted. And gracious knows,
Yep.
they have to move the levee again.
Mhm.
Original Kenner, old Kenner, will be eaten up.
Well, Old Kenner is really pretty much from the railroad tracks, or maybe a block or two the other side of the railroad tracks to the river, isn't it?
Yes, primarily.
What's now roughly the Rivertown area?
All right, we'll find that original Kenner, old Kenner, I don't like to say South Kenner, although we refer to North Kenner, but South Kenner has its identity on the west bank of the Mississippi River, just across the river from Kenner. So you can't refer to this area as South Kenner because you'll be talking about the west bank of the Mississippi River. So that's why I like to use original Kenner or old Kenner. Now, the Kenner Museum is located on land in pasture plantation. Incidentally, Kenner, basically, starting from the St. Charles Parish line to the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain, the first third of Kenner is Oakland Plantation. The middle section, third of Kenner, would be Belgrove. And the last third of Kenner would be pasture plantation. And when the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad cut through the Kenner plantations in 1852, Philip Minor Kenner was just ahead of his times, and he conceived the idea that there would be the railroad going through the plantations would promote a real estate boom. So that's when he hired W.T. Thompson to lay out Kennerville. And the center of Kennerville, we could use Williams Street as a focal point, hitting the Mississippi River and that straddle.
Those plantations were owned by a family named Kenner?
They were owned by the Kenner family.
All three, a pasture.
William Kenner was a Virginian who came to Louisiana around the 1800s. Very prominent. He was from a very prominent Virginia family. Like many young men, he had itchy feet and he wanted to move on and seek his fortune. Well, he is the founder of the Kenner branch, the Louisiana branch of the Kenner family. And he was the father of Philip Minor Kenner, the founder of Kenner. And I'm inclined to believe that Philip Minor Kenner didn't name Kenner for himself, but I think he named it for his famous family. Of course, some people say that Philip Minor Kenner is a namesake. Mm-hmm. But I really believe that because the Kenner, original Kenner, bears names of all of the members of the Kenner family, the men, and of course the ladies. And it was the most famous of the Kenners was Duncan Farrar Kenner. He was Secretary of Confederacy.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He was the ambassador plenipotentiary to France, and he was a member of the Congress. Brilliant man. And he married into the Blanchet family. Brangers are primarily from up the river, Donistonville area. And Duncan Farrar Kenner built Ashland Plantation, Belle Helene. If you've never been to Ashland Plantation is on the east bank of the Mississippi River, located at Darrow, Louisiana, which is about 10 miles above the Sunshine Bridge. Fortunately, the people who own it today have done a beautiful job of preservation by placing a new roof and preserving the interior, the exterior. The interior is still gutted, but there are many priceless items in the building. In fact, William Butler Kenner's bedroom set, William Kenner's bedroom set. And when I visited the place, we had I had a photographer, amateur photographer with me, and I said, Joe, now look, I'm gonna get in the bed, I'm gonna lie in that bed, you focus your camera, and I want you to take a picture of me lying in William Kenner's bed. And William Kenner's owned Oakland Plantation. And that bed was in the Oakland Plantation house. They had a little barricade, roped off area. Well, the caretaker was there, but I said, well, I'm gonna do it in a hurry, and all he could tell me, well, you can't do that. By that time, you'll have the picture, and I'll get out of the bed. Well, that's what I did. And I got pictures of me lying in.
You'll notice as you go into the town that some of the houses face the railroad rather than face the street, which is rather curious. The reason for this being that the railroad tracks came through in about 1850, and many of the streets hadn't been laid out yet because of the economic conditions of the time following the Civil War. And Reconstruction. It was not the best time in the world to go into a real estate venture. So the town had its roots in this, in the development of the railroad.
Tell me about the railroad coming through in the 1850s. This is what you said gave Kenner its identity, because it had just been plantation, pasture land, farming up until that point. And Mr. Kenner decided that this would be a good stopping point for the railroad?
Yes, they had a railroad station here. As I told you, the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad ran through the Kenner plantations in 1852. It was 1855 when Kennerville was laid out and open for settlement. And we had a railroad station here. In fact, we have a photograph on the wall. I'm sure you will have taken a picture of it, or you will, of the old railroad station, because the railroad and the Mississippi River were the only two means of transportation at that time. Now, you might have had a dirt road along the Mississippi River, but that took hours and hours and hours to. But the river boats used to stop here in Kenner, and naturally they brought in freight, and a lot of freight was removed from here.
Wasn't Kenner like the truck garden capital of the South?
Yes, Kenner was in about around the turn of the century. You had many Italians who had moved into the area, and they were all truck farmers, all involved in gardening. Kenner was the South's greatest vegetable center. And we had, about several packing houses, they call them packing sheds, where the farmers would bring their produce, and it would be packed, and then shipped in boxcars to the north, to the east. And of course, in those days, people in Kenner didn't have to go to the supermarket to get fresh vegetables. All they had to do is go to one of the packing houses, and they had all the fresh vegetables they wanted. And of course, I think the greatest among those products that were shipped out were, of course, green shallots. Some people call them green onions, cabbage, turnips, carrots, spinach, mustard, sweet peppers, hot peppers, eggplants, gourds of all types, pumpkins, but primarily parsley, shallots, and cabbage. Oh, more cabbage was shipped out of Kenner, and shallots and parsley. And we had as many as maybe 8, 10, 20 carloads of vegetables moving out of Kenner.
Was the land here especially good? Or was it just know-how of the people?
The best farmland in the country. And unfortunately, what has happened? Progress, houses being built, subdivisions being built, and of course, naturally, I guess you would have to say that rapid transportation has brought in a lot of competition in the produce area that, especially things that are being imported, that helped but it was primarily progress.
Now, in the political history of Jefferson Parish, it seems to me that there are 2 great loci, one on each side of the river, and the 2 of the few places that were incorporated. On the west bank, you seem to have Gretna, which is one focus of influence and government, and on the east bank, it seems to have been Kenner.
Quite right. The Mississippi River, probably the greatest single asset that Jefferson Parish has.
Oh, really? A lot of people think of it as a barrier.
Oh, well, it is. It is. It shouldn't be. I don't think it is, because I love the West Bank. I love all parts of Jefferson Parish. But many people think in terms of East Jefferson. Many people think in terms of West Jefferson. Now, in those days, the early days, well, Kenner and Gretna were the 2. Well, Gretna is celebrating its sesquicentennial this year. That means 150 years. Kenner is not quite 150 years. We might catch up with them one day. We hope, but I doubt it. But we're pretty close. And of course, because of transportation and crossing that river. Incidentally, I might mention, the skiff ferry was the first means of crossing the river here in Kenner. And it operated from the foot of William Street to South Kenner. And I might mention this, we have a beautiful picture of the skiff ferry, and incidentally, one of my ancestors operated the skiff ferry. We also have some pictures showing back in 1899 when the Mississippi River froze. And of course, what actually happened is you had severe freeze in the north, the ice was broken up, sudden warm weather, it floated down the Mississippi River, and we had a severe freeze, went down to 6.9 degrees in 1899. It was Carnival Day. And these chunks of ice that floated down the Mississippi River fused together and gave you the appearance that the Mississippi River was frozen. And we have a photograph in the museum here showing the skiff the day before with people sitting in it, and the skiff on the Bachelor crushed the next day.
you can see the development of the waves of immigrants as they came in. The Germans who came around 1848 after the Franco-Prussian War, the Irish who came to escape the potato famine, they came around the 1840s and 50s. There were many freed black men of color who settled here also and planted and had small businesses.
There were waves of immigration, sort of. There was the railroad people who came in, and around the turn of the century there was the Italian farmers who came in. Now, you're part of the German wave. Where did you come from?
Well, most of the Germans in this area came from the city of Lafayette.
Which is now roughly the Garden District, Irish Channel section of New Orleans.
That's right. You had the city of Lafayette, and we lost the city of Lafayette to New Orleans in the 50s.
That was like a legislative fiat. They took it away from Jefferson and gave it to New Orleans.
That's right, gave it to New Orleans. Then we lost Jefferson City. That's where the Jefferson City Buzzards come from.
The Carnival Club, yeah.
The Carnival organization, marching. And then we lost that, maybe in the late 60s. And then the city of Carrollton was the last section that we lost.
Now, the Jefferson Parish Courthouse was there at one time.
Yes, the Benjamin Franklin School on Carrollton Avenue, and is it Apple or
something like that?
Somewhere right in that area. That was old Jefferson Parish Courthouse.
Why did they keep taking sections of Jefferson and giving it to Orleans?
Well, I guess as areas developed, people wanted services. And being associated with a big city, naturally they would get services that perhaps they wouldn't get in outlying areas.
That makes sense, I suppose.
I would assume. And then, of course, I think some politics was mixed up into it, which is always the case.
Was there any industry in Kenner, or was it pretty much, the railroad, the farming?
Well, among the earliest industries was the two sawmills. We had the Louisiana Box and Lumber Company, which was a descendant of the Southwestern Box and Lumber. That was among one of the earliest industries. And of course, they made many things. And of course, boxes, barrels, and crates, and they made flooring and other pieces. But primarily it was associated, an industry that developed, was associated with the farming and so on. Now then you had Mancuso Box and Barrel, one of the early industries. You had the Anchor Sawmill. The Anchor Sawmill made oars of various sizes. They made implement handles, like handles for shovels and other implements. And they shipped these things all over the world. Now that's way back. That's one of the earliest industries in Canada. And of course we got to mention the Coleman Iron Foundry. And of course we all know in the New Orleans area, wrought iron, all kinds of filigree iron work was very popular. In the early days, they also made cannon and cannonball. It was during the Civil War when the area...
Spoons.
Butler the Beast. His forces occupied the area, and they occupied Oakland Plantation House and many others. Well, I don't want to tell you what invading troops will do to an area, and I won't identify those troops, but he ordered the destruction of the coal iron foundry. It's reported that he burned the the building and then pushed it into the Mississippi River.
You know, we didn't talk about, and that's the airport. Of course, this is, you know, one of the biggest probably industries in Kenner now, all of the jobs associated with Moisant.
Yes.
There was something there before Moisant, wasn't it? Or was the name just different?
No, that was, they grew vegetables there. It was under cultivation, farmland. And then right after World War II, that's when they built the airport there. It started out as the Moisant Field,
First terminal
Airport.
was like a Quonset hut,
Do
wasn't
you
it?
know the, yes, the first terminal was a Quonset hut. In fact, we have a picture of it up on the wall there, right there, a large picture of the original terminal. In the case there, we have a program when the airport was actually dedicated, and a little blue shovel in there is a shovel that I used to scoop up some dirt and turn over along in the dedication ceremony. But I think this year, just about a month or so ago, the Aviation Board celebrated its 50th birthday of creation, the Aviation Board. Now, the terminal was there before, but it has taken up a lot of land that was owned by old families. Some of the land was owned by one of the early homesteads that repossessed it during the Depression days. And of course, Mayor Maestri was instrumental in locating it there because he bought up a lot of that land that the homestead owned when they went bankrupt.
And it's still something of a bone of contention that Orleans runs part of Kenner where the airport is.
Unfortunately, we got to almost have a city within a city. But I believe a lot of those things, of late, many of those things have been sort of, I think you have a better relationship now with the airport board than we've had in many, many years.
The Clancy family is a fascinating part of Kenner history.
See, John Clancy was Sheriff Clancy's father. He was a railroader, a farmer. He was one of the early postmasters. He was a member of the Jefferson Parish School Board in 1910 when the old school board building on Huey Long Avenue was built.
Mm-hmm.
So John Clancy was elected to the police jury following his term on the school board. He was an alderman of the city of Kenner, and I believe that was in 1926. And I think he passed away in December while he was an alderman.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a farmer, as I told you. He was a very active person. He was a small man. He used to play the violin, the fiddle. He was married to Maggie Long Clancy, Margaret Long, but she was known as Maggie.
Now they were the parents of Anastasia Alexander?
Yes.
Okay.
Sheriff John Clancy and Margaret Long Clancy were the parents of Sheriff Frank J. Clancy and Anastasia Alexander. Anastasia Clancy Alexander, who was a member of the school board for many years.
About 19, I think.
And she was ultimately president of the school board. She was a very close friend of mine. The Clancys were close friends to my father. Now, Stephen Jefferson, you asked me about him. And of course, the junior high school in Kenner bears his name. He was an early principal at the Kenner High School. I attended the Kenner Public School, first grade through high school, graduated from Kenner High School, and Mr. Barber was principal of the school at the time that I attended Kenner High School. And he's a wonderful person. His father was a doctor, dentist, and he has always been my idol.
Steve Barber?
Yes.
Why was that?
And when I was appointed principal of John Clancy School, it was supposed to open in September 1954, but it wasn't. The school wasn't ready. So they organized John Clancy School on the campus of the Kenner High School in some of the temporary buildings that have been torn down since. But we were a school within a school. We functioned as a separate school. I was principal. But Mr. Barber was my guiding godfather. And he told me, always be a good listener. You're going to encounter some very interesting challenges. Be a good listener. And after the person who has some problems unwinds and cools off, then you can say what you would like to say quietly and gently. But don't get involved in the challenge.
It's the same sort of thing a psychologist or a psychiatrist does. You
Yes.
listen, gather all the data.
And then make your decision. Hopefully you're right, and in most chances you will be. I can't help from mentioning this great lady. She taught me in the 5th grade, Agnes Stahl. She retired from the school system of Jefferson Parish. She not only taught me in the 5th grade, but in later years, I taught at Jefferson High School with J.V. Fairchild, James Virgil Fairchild, or rather Joseph Virgil Fairchild, and Agnes Stahl. Now, her family was one of the early families of Kenner. She was a great lady. And I can tell you, she made us memorize everything. And to this day, I haven't forgotten. And when I'm driving the car, frequently people think I'm talking to myself when I am reciting poems, excerpts from Shakespeare, or possibly say my ABCs or my times table. Of course, we don't do that anymore now.
No, and I think we're the poorer for it.
But she made us memorize every state in the Union and the capital, and to this day, Maine, Augusta, New Hampshire, Concord, Vermont, Montpelier, Massachusetts, Boston, Connecticut, and so on down the line, and I still remember. So I am a firm believer in the old school.
You mentioned earlier Stephen Barbary and John Clancy, whom schools are named for, and you just named another one, Joseph Fairchild. Tell me about him.
Virgil Fairchild. He taught me in the 8th grade, and he was one of the, well, he came from North Louisiana. Incidentally, the J.V. Fairchild Middle School is named for him. And I not only had the pleasure of being a student of Joe Fairchild, but I taught for him for about 15 years at the old Jefferson High School. And then we moved to the new Jefferson High School, which was across from the Jefferson racetrack. And I used to teach the room on the second floor overlooking the racetrack. And when the horses were running, of course, I'm sure the kids learned more about mathematics watching those horses go by than I taught them.
What kind of person was Joe Fairchild?
Wonderful person. When he came to Kenner and taught at Kenner High School, Mr. Barber was principal. He was a young man. He had just married. And at that time, Kenner had probably maybe 2 or 3 telephones in the whole town. And I'll never forget when Joe Fairchild received news that he was a proud father. Mr. Barber let him go to Felix and Block's store to make a phone call. And he was a young man. He was quite a fat man because he headed for there running down to talk to probably his wife and maybe somebody else. But quite interesting. He taught me science at Kenner, 8th grade science. And we had an experiment with phosphorus. Of course, he cautioned us carefully that it's got to remain underwater because it will explode. And he saws off a tiny chip of the phosphorus, and of course, maybe he did it as part of his instructions, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He waves a little piece of phosphorus up that was at the end of this utensil he had, and went off. Well, a couple of these students that wore stockings maybe had a little tiny hole, or maybe not, and all that, but he visited me, had lunch with me at John Clancy's school one day, and we started talking about the old days, and I reminded him of that incident, and he got a big chuckle out of it and so on. There were many other interesting things, but he was a great person.
There's so many people, it seems, from Kenner that have schools named for them. Anastasia Alexander, John Clancy, Stephen Barbary, Joe Fairchild, Schneckenberger. The Schneckenbergers are an old family, aren't they?
Very definitely. It's an old railroad. They were railroaders. In fact, the Schneckenbergers and the Beckers and the Cantrells and the Clancys and the McIntoshes and the Longs and the Damianas. And I know I'm going to get in trouble because
you're going to forget
when
someone.
You start naming names, you're going to miss one, and that's happened to me before.
But why were there so many teachers that schools are named for?
Well, at the time that I graduated from Kenner High School, that was right around the Depression time, see? And we had many young people throughout Jefferson Parish who went to college on scholarships from the Jefferson Parish Police Jury. That's one of the tributes that we could pay to the early police jury. Weaver R. Toledano was a member of the police jury from this area, and he was president of the police jury. And I believe he was on the police jury for, I think, 35 years. And I think in our research, we came to the conclusion that probably he was in public office longer than anyone else in the area. And he loved Kenner. In the early days of Kenner, we were short of money. and he took care of many of our streets with gravel and ditching and all kinds of that. He was very much interested in the young people, and he was dedicated as far as education was concerned, although he never served on the school board. But he was instrumental, along with Sheriff Clancy and others of the time, in providing scholarships for the young people in Jefferson Parish. And I think I counted around between 35 and 40 school teachers in Kenner. They were all in teaching school. And I believe, of course now I can't say that the Kenner young people were the only ones that received scholarships, because all over the parish this went on. And I believe that's the reason why you have so many schools named for these people. Now most of these people, or many of them were people that moved in the early days. Do you know that when I started teaching in Jefferson Parish, I started at McDonough Jefferson in Gretna, or McDonoughville. And to get to school, I rode the bus, streetcar. I used to meet Mr. Superintendent J.C. Ellis and Mr. Berto, Fred Berto. He was my first principal, and many members of his family were in the school system for years. I used to meet him and Mr. Ellis at the Jackson Avenue ferry, getting his automobile. Then we'd ride the ferry. We'd drop Mr. Ellis off at the school board office. And at that time, the school board office was in the old Gretna Courthouse on Huey Long Avenue, which is the Gretna City Hall today. And as you entered, there was a little room on the right-hand side, front of the building. Who was the school board office personnel? Superintendent J.C. Ellis, Julia Reno, who was she was everything. She was the secretary, and she did everything. And Lemuel Higgins. And later, of course, they added personnel as it expanded. But incidentally, I was at LSU. And Lem Higgins was a senior at LSU when I was there, and I'm sure it must have been a freshman or a sophomore or something like that. And I used to go, he was taking a course, and he was collecting bugs and bees and butterflies and so on. I used to go with him with a cyanide bottle and a net, and we would go out in the fields catching those things. Those were great days.
The Clancys, I'm prejudiced, I must admit, in favor of Irish politicians. I grew up with them, coming from the Irish Channel. They're a fascinating family.
Yes, Irish people are wonderful.
When did they start in Kenner? How far back did the Clancys go?
Oh, I'm pretty sure the Clancys go back to the early days, around the 1850s or 60s, somewhere around that time. As I mentioned, John Clancy was a railroader. That was his main occupation. Mm-hmm. And he was closely associated with the railroad.
So they moved out here when the railroad came through?
I'm pretty certain. I talked to his grandson. Unfortunately, I have more information about the Clancys than he could provide to me. In fact, I gave him information that he didn't have.
Now, Sheriff Clancy, I suppose, to people of my age, maybe other ages too, is the best known because I was growing up at the time when I suppose he was at the height of his power and influence, because he was sheriff of the parish for about 35 years?
28 years.
28?
This house is Sheriff Clancy's house, and Vera Watney Clancy, his wife. Now, she is from a very old Kenner family and a wealthy family. The house was built in 1922, and it was in this house that Sheriff Clancy started out as a young man after he was married, and it was in this house where he reared his two beautiful daughters, Callista and Eunice, and many of his grandchildren. Of course, they were a very close-knit family, and the family they were together all the time. Now, the house, as I told you, was built in 1922, and incidentally, the address of this place is 1922 3rd Street, coincidentally. Now, it was in 1928, Sheriff Clancy was elected. He was sheriff for 28 years. And he graduated from Tulane University. That's where he got his law degree. He was a member of the first Tulane band. He was quite a musician.
What did he play?
What is the horn, the big...
Tuba?
Tuba, I think so.
Tuba, trumpet, trombone. Tuba's a great big one.
Yeah, I believe that's the one. And his brother, Martin Clancy, was quite a musician.
Martin Clancy was Frank's brother? I knew Martin Clancy.
Wait, now,
I'm getting ahead. Okay.
You were talking about Martin Clancy, the son,
okay.
who was
He's the
quite
music
a music
consultant for the school system.
Consultant for Jefferson Parish school system for many years. Now,
Frank Clancy was in the Tulane band when he was a
yes, the
student.
first Tulane band, and I believe 1914 or 15.
Did he keep up with the music his whole life, or did he let it go?
No, music was probably, basically, he did play in marching bands and did take part in that, but it gradually got away from it. Mm-hmm. But to get back, he was a very popular sheriff of Jefferson Parish.
To be elected for 28 years.
I have the greatest respect for Sheriff Clancy and the members of the Clancy family.
The thing about Irish politicians that I've always liked is that I know it's fashionable among some people now to look back at that time and say, bossism, ward politics and all like that. But by golly, those people delivered services and help to people who needed them. Who were often the small people, the working class people and all like that. And that was the basis of their political power.
Well, I grew up knowing Sheriff Clancy as a youngster. And Sheriff Clancy, incidentally, his name was Frank James Clancy. And I know, well, you can look at me and see that I've been around. I was born in Kenner, 500 William Street, Jefferson Parish. Both sides of my family were involved in Kenner activities, politics. They held many, many offices in the political arena. And I love Sheriff Clancy. He was so kind to so many people in Kenner. And during the Depression, when so many people were out of work, he really, I could say, he started a welfare program that was later started on a national level. When people came to him, he couldn't provide them a job. When they needed groceries or they needed medicine, he would write out a little slip, the name, take it, and he'd tell them to take it to this grocery store and they'll charge it to me. Same way with prescriptions and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very kind man, very generous.
Well, people like that, it seems to go against, Lord Acton's famous epigram, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, because this house, which is now the Kenner Museum, it's a nice house, it's a very pleasant house, but it's a very modest house.
Yes.
And the man lived here his whole life.
That's
so, whatever his accomplishments, not a whole lot of this world's goods seemed to stick to him in his personal lifestyle.
Well, even the ranch house. I don't know if you visited the ranch house in your lifetime. It was a small log cabin. In fact, less spacious as this house.
Leaving the Kenner Museum, we embarked on the walking tour of Old Kenner, known as Rivertown. Next to the museum is the Rivertown Plaza, a gazebo surrounded by benches which serves as an outdoor performance area. To know what places are must-sees, we went to the tourism office on Short Street, which is housed in what was once the Kenner Town Hall, Courthouse, and City Jail. Incidentally, the concrete ruins behind the building are the remains of what was once the power plant of the city in the days when its population totaled 3,000. We begin our tour at the foot of Williams Boulevard, where a cypress cross marks the site of the landings of the first explorers on their way to the Gulf of Mexico. At the foot of Williams, we also find the Wildlife and Fisheries Museum, housed in what was once the post office, among other uses. A trip up Williams reveals many old Victorian structures which now house gift shops. This building was once a dance hall, silent movie house, boxing arena, and library. Of note, too, are the unique light standards which date from the 1920s. Their brothers may be found in the streets of New Orleans. As we approach the railroad tracks and airline highway, we come across two structures which commemorate events important to Kenner's history, one restored and one not. A survivor of the packing shed so important to the days when Kenner was the Garden of the South, this building dates from the 1920s. There is also the depot and locomotive abutting the Louisiana State Railroad Museum, which is a hands-on delight for children of all ages. Our thanks to Chris Lochbaum, Emma Pearson, and the Kenner Museum and Office of Tourism for their glimpse into the past of Kenner, Louisiana. A lifelong resident of Kenner, Mr. Chris Lochbaum is the retired principal of John Clancy Elementary School. He has been curator of the Kenner Museum since its beginning and is a member of the Jefferson Historical Society and served on the commission celebrating Jefferson's sesquicentennial. Thank you for being with us. Join us again for Jefferson Genesis. Next time, we may be telling the story of your little bit of home here in Jefferson Parish.